Well, it never hurts to repeat a good message, Jeff. So there you go.
Anyhow, yeah, one of the most important things I think is that yes, we did get caught by COVID, and that has really kind of interrupted. It's not only, and I really didn't address the methods, but I can a little bit. That it's not only interrupted the timing of things, but it also has fundamentally reshaped our methods. And so we went from a very targeted structure to now more of a snowball and almost a random, well, not almost a random selection, a random selection. So anyhow, I'm going to ask Emily Regan. If you go to the second slide, please, Regan. I'm going to start there. The only people that Wayne hasn't introduced yet is that we are very closely. This is an OMAFRA project, as with a lot of the work that you've been looking at so far. And we're working very, very closely right now with OMAFRA. Drew Crinklaw is our primary contact at OMAFRA and working with us. Julie is away, but hopefully comes back when she's done with her secondment and rejoins us. So I know that most of you have seen most of this presentation or parts of this presentation on multiple occasions, so I don't want to belabor it, but for those of you, or the introduction piece, I should say, but for those of you who haven't, we need to be aware of aggregates connections with agriculture, because it is a significant industry in Ontario context that shares a lot of the very same landscape as agriculture does. One of the most important things to keep in mind, I'm jumping points here, but one of the most important things to keep in mind is that aggregate extraction and agriculture occur on almost identical land base. Especially when you get down in southern Ontario, down below basically Barrie, there's a competition for the land base because the very same forces that created the agriculture land that we've got in southern Ontario created the gravel deposits as well. Okay, and so what we find is that there's now a very intense competition for that land. At the same time, this has been my line throughout, is that everything that we do requires aggregate, okay? Most especially all of the roads, all of the infrastructure, all of the buildings, all of the houses, your swimming pool, all of those things that we are building and living upon are requiring massive amounts of aggregate. What's the number there? 164 million tons of aggregate are used in Ontario each year. And so what that means, it translates into the individual usages. So each person in Ontario consumes on average about 12 tons of aggregate. Okay, so a visualization, that's about 3/4 of your average dump truck. So a 4-person family would use 3 dump truck loads of aggregate every year. Doesn't mean they use it directly. Most of our uses are indirect. So new road construction, new building construction, all of this is contributing to what we are doing within society. At the same time, okay, I lost my point. Okay, I lost my, in terms of actual dollars and cents, the aggregate industry contributes approximately $1.6 billion to the Ontario economy. That is dwarfed by the agricultural contributions to the economy, but we do need to keep in mind that that is a major industry. So we're looking at about a 30-to-1 ratio. The difficulty, though, is that neither one of them can be ignored. We have to have them. The point that I was trying to make is that we need to keep in mind as well that aggregate being a very high volume, high mass product, it needs to be close to the point of consumption. What is really significant about aggregate and aggregate consumption is the fact that it costs an awful lot of money to move it. So where a lot of people have suggested, why don't we take the aggregate out of the shield, for example, and then truck it down, that would add multitudes multiple factors of cost to the cost of construction. So it really needs to be used in the place where it's taken from, or taken from the place in which it's used. So where I think the other point that I really want to make in the introduction is that where we have a sense of agriculture as being this very positive, pleasing, constructive industry, agriculture has a very, very positive aspect to it. Aggregate has a very, very negative aspect to it. Aggregate is a resource industry that is extractive, that ruins the landscape, that is very destructive, as opposed to agriculture's constructive nature. What this does is it creates a very particular public perception. And so the public perception of aggregate is negative. The public perception of agriculture is positive. And so we tend to have this perception that aggregate is a negative industry, agriculture is a positive industry. So what we're trying to do, next slide, please, Regan. What we're trying to do, the project is now looking at the relationships that exist between aggregate producers and agricultural producers that live and work right next to each other. There is very, very little literature that is addressing this relationship. There's very, very little, virtually zero literature, as a matter of fact, that addresses the impact that aggregate has on agriculture. If there is any literature that is looking at it, what we're looking at is a very fragmented literature. So something that does maybe look at the effect of dust on crop growth, but it's not aggregate produced dust on crop growth. We're looking at things like the effect of water level, water table on crop growth, but not the effect of aggregate produced changes in water level or water quality on crop growth. And so what we need to do is we need to make these connections. Okay, so the main objective is that we're looking at the relationship between aggregate extraction and agricultural production. So in other words, what do farmers see happening on their farms because they're living and working right beside, or at least very, very close to aggregate production? So what we're asking now, the research questions, what are farmers' attitudes toward aggregate operations, I should say, so the actual business. How do farmers perceive aggregate operations effects on their business? Ultimately, what we're looking for are what are the best practices. Okay, so we are working on finding out how then do these two major industries work, live together in very, very positive ways. I'm trying to think. Next slide, please, Regan. So currently, we are at the point where, following the interruption from COVID, we are talking now to the industry players. So currently, we are in the midst of speaking with farmers in Ontario. Wayne, Pete, and I are focused on interviewing the farmers, and we're about halfway through that process. We've been in contact with and made a connection with OFA, Ontario Federation of Agriculture. They have helped us. This is part of the really quick shift that we made in methods. So rather than being a targeted distribution of surveys, the OFA has assisted us in distributing the survey to at least their entire membership across Ontario. They also helped us out with the survey, focusing it on agriculture in general. We've been in touch with Ontario Stone, Sand, and Gravel. They've helped us in locating aggregate operators, providing us with contact information. We're looking at TOARC. They've discussed a few of the issues around rehabilitation with us, which is becoming a little bit more central as we go through and we actually find out what the farmers are interested in. We've spoken with MHBC and a number of other consultants. MHBC has been invaluable to us. We're speaking with planning staff, and we're going to be developing those relationships a little bit further as we move into the key informant interviews. We are also, as always, in close contact with OMAFRA with both advice and information. Okay, slide please, Regan. So what are we finding? The survey came in with about 250 responses. And as a matter of fact, what we're finding is overall that we've got a relatively neutral response. Okay, so we've asked, well, we asked a number of questions, but I'm looking at 4 key questions here and the responses that we've received from them. So this slide is taking a look at what are some of the positive effects that aggregate has had on your farm operation. And so from the left to right, and basically in order of response, scale, number, what we've got are access to aggregate. Okay, so these are positive responses or positive effects. So farmers are happy with access to aggregate. There are also infrastructure improvements. One of the things that's played out in the interviews is that because rural infrastructure is frequently old and has not been upgraded in a long time, when an aggregate operation comes in, you end up with infrastructure improvements, generally in terms of roads, most especially, and hydro. Employment opportunities increase. People have got to be hired to deal with the aggregate. We've got aggregate companies becoming involved in the local communities. Rehab plans, okay, this is coming up again and again. Rehab plans might benefit the community. Positive changes to drainage. They have noted water quantity, a positive outcome, water quality, a positive outcome, and other. So comments like local jobs, I think this is a little tongue in cheek, but waterfront property coming in the next couple of years. Hunting opportunities, which is interesting. So land reclamation, so somebody who works for an aggregate operation. And then many just checked other with none. Slide, please, Regan. Negative. I think that we've got, actually, it seems we've got a little bit less in negative responses. So from left to right, traffic volume is a huge issue. Okay, we've got big trucks on small roads. Dust, we've got road use, again, big trucks on big roads, specifically in terms of compatibility with farm equipment. And this is an important thing, I think, that's coming up through the interviews. Noise, blasting, separate from noise. Water quantity, more negative than positive. Water quality, more negative than positive. Visual and aesthetic issues, encroachment on property, drainage issues, lighting, odor, and then other. Other, they're talking about hours of operation, crushing, fencing, not being able to pasture on the other side of the haul road. Haul road's cutting farms in half. I've heard that as well. Dangerous driving, poor weed control, habitat loss, tax increases. There's a lot of negative comments that I don't think I've got time left to deal with. I'm going to have to be very quick. Slide, please, Regan. Overall, what we're seeing here is that we're neutral to positive, okay? The slide is looking at how do you feel that the activities have impacted your farm. So the negative is relatively high, but the positive and negative, and the not affected together all come together to me to say that we're looking at neutral to positive more than anything else. Slide, Regan. And at the same time, relationship with the operation is even more positive. Okay, so again, we're neutral to positive, and so that's suggesting that there's something good going on. That is in contradiction. I think I will go to, yeah, slide again, Regan. So what it's suggesting is the public perception is inaccurate, but there are still, I should say, problems that need to be addressed. So from the interviews, a lot of reinforcement of what the survey was saying. Okay, so we are looking at overall perceptions being largely neutral. The interviews that we've done between positive and very positive experiences and negative and very negative experiences, and then one with, it was a fun interview because every question asked, she's like, no effect. And that leads into the next point, that the attitudes toward extraction are very much tied to the place where they occur. The one that's extremely neutral is in the Muskokas, where you're looking at a much more resource-based economy, that farming is perhaps the interruption, not aggregate. The ones that are very positive or very neutral, I've been doing, the interviews I've done so far are in those spaces where there's competition, and a fair bit of a competition. And so you end up with, and they're just around, like they're in the fringes of the Toronto area. And so you've got investors coming out and investing at a distance in the Kawarthas in Prince Edward County. And so they're there for the profit, and that's it. but you've got very, very positive, very, very negative. The farmers are asking, they're suggesting a very significant focus on the local. The good operators are focused on the local communities. Communication, and they've emphasized bidirectional communication is key. Sharing of space, roads and land. One of the things that they're emphasizing is the fact that not only is the aggregate equipment big, so is the agriculture equipment big. And again, it's the sharing that kind of surprised me here. Rehab has come up as a big focus. Not so much because rehab is considered to be post, or at least I was originally considering it post, but it indicates the attitude that the operator has toward the land. Water take is a big issue. Commentary on the fact that even under drought conditions, they're still operating and dropping the water aquifers. Apologies. Secondary use has become a big issue as well. Okay, so there are a lot of things that are coming up that are very interesting, and some of them that we weren't actually anticipating. So we've got a lot of I think, strong areas to begin working with on this. Slide, please, Regan. I think I'll kind of cut this one a little bit close. Right now, we are looking at completing the farmers interviews. We're in the middle of that. Regan is working on, so Wayne, Pete, and I are working on the interviews. Regan and Rachel are working on the key informants. So we're at the interview stage right now. From here, we start the analysis and the writing. So the biggest question that I'll leave you with is, especially in terms of key informants, where do we go? Who do we speak with? And then how do we, knowing what we know now, which is certainly interim, where do you want us to go from here?